Babatunde, and then he's from at UNISA, and I've got Zeenat Adam, and I've got also Catherine Grant. What we are going to do, I realized in the first panel that maybe the time wasn't properly explained, because we don't want a full presentation. You give us the pointers of what constitutes the thrust of your presentation, on the basis of which we are going to engage. And later on, based on the questions and the responses which are given, we're going to allow you another 2 minutes to wrap up, right? So I'm going to give you each 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes is 50. Then we go for engagement. Then we'll get back to 3 minutes, 3 minutes, which means if you're not concluded, you still have your famous 3 minutes waiting for you for the conclusion. But your conclusions are likely to be a lot richer based on what shall have come through the question class. Because all in all, you've got 45 minutes. So if there's still extra time, I think I'll give it to you. Yesterday, I thought there would be an extra time. Unfortunately, my clock was knocked out because there was no extra time. But the name shall remain undisclosed. Is it possible at least to get closer to the middle here? Unless those who come from Venda in Limpopo, there are always reasons why you take certain positions. Right? Please, if you can, let's get closer to this side, all the angles, and then, yeah. Okay. Babatunde.
Oh, yes.
Either you sit there or you come here, but looking at you in deference to the elders. You know, when I speak steady, the word comes out, the voice comes out clear, right? And there are elders here. All right, if you are comfortable.
Oh, yeah.
All right, that's fine. But I was trying to urge you to come here. All right.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I know it's the previous session now. So I'll try as much as possible to keep everyone interested in what I'm about to say, so we can engage from the discussion. So my task is to look at Nigeria-South Africa relations, particularly in the context of regional integration, African regional integration. Of course, we all know that these are the two regional regions, two great powers, at least in the African context. And these are the two powers expected to drive regionalism on the continent. You know, similar to your Franco-German partnership in Europe. I was in China last week, and I was talking to an Indian, and we were having a conversation around politics and politics of superpowers within a particular region. And I was trying to explain to this Indian about. And of course, the Indian lady had said, assumed that between Nigeria and South Africa being the two big powers, being on the same continent, would possibly have a visa-free policy between, took it for, thinking that should be the case. And I had to explain, painfully explain, that these two powers actually have some of the most restrictive visa policies between each other, and I also had to explain that they are essentially frenemies. They're not exactly the best of friends, and because of that, regionalism suffers on the continent. The ability to drive into deepen regional integration in Africa. So essentially, without wasting much time, I'll just say there's certain things I will be looking at in terms of that cooperation and how both would actually ensure that the relations between them contribute to deepening African regionalism. So, yeah. Do I still have time?
You have time.
Oh, I thought
you used 2 minutes. You still have 3.
Oh, I still have 3. Wow. There's a lot of time. So now, when you look at both Nigeria and South Africa, one of the key problems between both is that both fact, both powers actually have, a very, rather sad, dull and bland foreign policy approach. So it's not dynamic. You don't see the kind of dynamic foreign policy approach between both. Coming to the table, so you look at Nigerian foreign policy towards South Africa, it's not as sharp and dynamic as you expected it. In fact, I would even go to the extent of saying the kind of foreign policy approach Nigeria had towards apartheid South Africa was even more robust, more engaged, perhaps because you also had a different set of people. You had thinkers, if I continue to mention names of people who were shaping the Nigerian foreign policy then, as opposed to those who are currently shaping it now. And of course, Nigeria is also bogged down by its domestic, domestic problems, fighting Boko Haram, corruption, youth unemployment, and all of those things. South Africa, again, was also bogged down by its internal contradictions as well, to be able to come to the table and to have an assertive foreign policy approach, particularly towards South Africa and towards Nigeria. And it's quite, it's a very sad story that when you ask Nigerian officials and South African officials, foreign policy actors, to explain to you how scalable foreign policy approach to continental regionalism in Africa, scalable. I'm not talking of rhetoric here. Things, measures, things you can measure and how to implement them. You'll be so surprised that you will not get anything serious, anything significant from both players in terms of shaping Nigerian foreign policy and South African foreign policy. And of course, I was also listening to President Mbeki here, and that was actually the Mbeki Obasanjo years were regarded as the golden years of Nigerian South African foreign policy, which was quite good, but it was also built on chemistry between both years. They liked each other, and of course, I'm still expecting someone to also write about the Sussex component of that relationship, Babatunde and the rest, and how we were able to bring all of those, to bring that into shaping the foreign policy. But again, you can't build that kind of strategic engagement on chemistry, because that's why we're sitting here today and not seeing anything tangible, because both key players are no longer president, and there were no serious institutions built to maintain and to continue that relations.
I like that. Short and sweet. Yeah, my turn. Okay.
5 to 7 minutes. You mustn't stop until
I'm exhausted. I want to begin by thanking the IGD for the invitation and to tell a little bit of the story about some kind of a relation I may have had with the IGD. 25 years ago, I was a young person with ambitions to be a diplomat, and I was matriculating at the time. I was volunteering at a radio station that was a local community radio station, and I had a program on the weekends called Global Dialogue, in which I would invite people to discuss international issues. And once I reached university the following year, I was so pleased to hear that an institute had been founded with a similar name to the program that I was hosting. And many of the people who were part of that foundation are unaware that they were my unofficial mentors throughout my career, and that they have shaped me to be who I am today without having direct interaction with the Institute. So I really want to wish you all the best for the 25th anniversary. That said, I've been asked to speak about the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and South Africa's position vis-a-vis human rights in these areas. When I look at this, I think that we've had a year of change and upheaval both domestically and internationally. And it has given us an opportunity for a revision of our leadership structures under President Ramaphosa, and provides us an opportunity to reflect and redress our positions in the continent as well as on the international arena. Our assumption of the third term as a non-permanent member of the Security Council was serendipitous in that perhaps we needed a space to reclaim our former stature and I think many of the speakers before me have spoken about what our moral high ground was, the kind of position that the position of respect that we had, the kind of moral authority we had on the international stage, and we lost that. So here's an opportunity for us to regain it. But the question is, are we going about doing that in the correct way? I find that whilst our statements on key issues facing the Council have been noble, they've been rooted in some of our original principled positions, we still appear to be stuck in rhetoric. We still appear to be making illustrious statements without tangible actions. On the Middle East and North Africa, while we have had consistency on the issue of Palestine, we have not evolved our policies to face the reality of the flagrant violations by the occupier of international resolutions with impunity. President Mbeki mentioned the increasing normalization of relations between the African continent and Israel, and that goes even further afield within the MENA region as well, and the impact that that is having on Palestinians. And this is evidenced by the lack of punitive measures within the United Nations against an occupier for violating their own resolutions. And it really renders the United Nations toothless. So we talk about reform of the United Nations, and we've been very vocal about it in all three of our terms. But the question is, how much more are we going to be speaking about it, and when do we actually have change? And I don't only mean in the Security Council with representation of regional powers like Nigeria, South Africa, India, and others, but how do we change the actual mechanisms of the United Nations and recognize that they are flawed institutions beyond the Security Council as well? I look at examples in the past 2 years where there have been exposés about people who have been deployed as part of the United Nations that have violated regulations in terms of sexual violence against the very people they're supposed to protect. What are we doing about that? What repercussions do we have? And can South Africa take the lead on this? But coming back to the Middle East and North Africa, in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, there was a deep securitization and an increase in the elite and the bourgeoisie benefiting from that securitization and war profiteering with the removal of trade barriers, reduction of wages, deindustrialization. It meant that the Arab governments had stripped their populations of social protections necessary to cope with the recession. Increased unemployment, recognition of the vast economic disparities, as well as the new war on terror with renditions, extrajudicial killings, torture programs, left the vulnerable reeling from a deep sense of inequality. And this was just the spark to ignite what we now refer to as the Arab Spring. So we saw this happen in Tunisia, we saw it move onwards to Egypt with Tahrir Square. Simon mentioned his own experience there. And what we began to witness was the rise in Islamic movements. They sought to, people sought to, let me say this differently, the elite sought to reassert their dominance and secure their own economic interests and courted foreign powers to be able to support them to do so and to reinforce their positions in these countries. With the rising Islamic tide, you found that a lot of the foreign countries wanted to quell that and wanted to get involved. So by the time the Arab Spring reached countries like Libya and Syria, these discussions were being held at the United Nations, and we found that the UN was deeply polarized. So South Africa has made a few statements recently about a unipolar world. And I want to play on this word and recognize that South Africa is behaving quite bipolar disorder rather than just simply looking at polarities. We say certain things in the United Nations and publicly, and we do the opposite. And more specifically when it comes to the Middle East. We may be very vocal on the Palestinian issue, but I fear that we do not have strong enough analysis of what is happening in the rest of this region. And when we look at what happened in the Arab Spring, we've now come full cycle to another global recession and another spark of more people taking to the streets. We now witness it in Iraq, and this is a direct repercussion of what had taken place with the American intervention into Baghdad in 2003. And these are the repercussions that we're seeing, where there's immense poverty, there's been crony capitalism, there has been corruption, and people are fed up. You're seeing it in Lebanon, you're seeing it in Iran. And this wave is going to continue because it's not just confined to the Middle East, but we're looking at the similar situations taking place in Latin America, similar situations taking place in Asia and in Africa. And we have to be cognizant that South Africa is not going to be immune to this. We too have deep disparities, and it's only a matter of time before our people take to the streets and before we start being vocal about those economic disparities. But when we talk about the Syrian uprising and the polarities that happened, I think that we also have to reflect on the relationships that South Africa has with some of the rising powers in the world. And I think that it is important to also look at our position within BRICS. We are not critical enough of our partners in BRICS, and we have shifted from having an economic relationship to having a political relationship that is translating into how we have our policies at the United Nations and elsewhere. So when it came to Syria, we were quite afraid after what had taken place in Libya and after our own voting on the Libyan Resolution 1973. Come Syria and we're totally shocked. We're afraid, we don't know how to take a position, and we don't want to call out those powers that are involved. So we don't talk about the human rights violations of the Syrian regime in cooperation with Russia and its partners. We don't talk about the barrel bombs. We don't talk about the torture prisons. And we don't talk about the percentage that goes approximately 95% of all human rights violations taking place by the government itself. Yet we talk about ISIS, which is approximately in the 2 percentile of violations against in terms of human rights violations. We talk about other Islamic groups, and we don't look at why those Islamic movements have risen, and we don't look at the root causes of it. We're still in an archaic mentality of post-9/11, and we've still been conditioned to be thinking about the world in those contexts, and it's time that we change that. It's time that we started looking differently. But also, when we look at our economic diplomacy and we consider how bravely we want to go out in the world and attract investment, and it is necessary and important because we need our economy to grow in order to prevent the kind of economic disparities that I spoke about earlier. But at the same time, does that mean that we forsake our principled positions on human rights? And I think that we have been doing that, perhaps consciously, perhaps unconsciously. And when we look at the weaponization of propaganda, we look at South Africa selling its weapons out to the rest of the world. We have Saudi Arabia and the UAE as the most prolific buyers of weapons currently. This week there was an expose about South Africa having been compromised. So last year I had written about South Africa selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE, and those weapons being used in Yemen against innocent civilians, and this was proven. Yet we have our checks and balances in terms of the NCACC, the Arms Trade Treaty, and we don't utilize the very mechanisms we have and resources that we have with us in order to have those checks and balances. And now we found that we have been so deeply compromised that it's actually reached the kind of terminology of treason and industrial espionage, with the Saudis having poached people from Denel who are sharing South African state secrets on the building of missile technology, and this has now been transferred to Saudi Arabia. We don't talk about South Africa being an exporter of apartheid, being an exporter of mercenaries who are going out into these countries and acting as part of private military security firms, but they carry the flag of South Africa with them, and they commit violations against innocent people in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, across the board. So when do we have those checks and balances? We had a statement by our ambassador at the United Nations talking about how we have wonderful legislation, probably better than anyone in the world when it comes to dealing with mercenary activities. We've never enforced the Foreign Military Assistance Act, and it has been 3 presidents now that we haven't done the follow-up act to that where we could prosecute South African mercenaries. We need to start looking at what we're doing on the continent in Africa, what we're doing when it comes to the MENA region, and what we foresee as the way forward. We talk about having foreign policies, but in as much as we have strong leadership, and many of you, as I mentioned, were my mentors when I was in the Foreign Service, we're not grooming a new Foreign Service, and we're not handing over to younger people. And this is important because we're looking at a wave of youth across the world who are disgruntled. And we need to have youthful ideas and innovations on how we address that. We cannot be using the old mechanisms that we have in the past. We need to look at the manner in which psychological warfare is being used against us using social media, that it's being used to carve out how people go to the voting stations, who they vote for, what they perceive as a threat and what they perceive as attractive. If we don't start thinking futuristically, we're going to find ourselves on the back foot. And I think that there was a writer who named this surveillance capitalism. So everything we do, our phones are being watched. You've got Facebook, you've got Twitter, you've got WhatsApp, and every movement you make is being monitored. Every time you click on something you like, it's being monitored and you are being profiled. With that profile, you are then being guided, and media is working its way into your psyche to make you believe this is what I want out of life. And that is something we need to be very careful about, and we need to be conscious of as we move forward. I think I've ignited a few questions in the audience, and we'll leave the rest for questions and answers.
Thanks very much. I'm going to change the tack a little bit now and speak about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement rather than human rights issues. I come at this from the perspective very much of the practicalities that former President Mbeki was talking about this morning in terms of thinking about how practical is this initiative and where is it going to take us in this day and age. So I think that the remarks made by President Mbeki this morning were quite interesting in terms of putting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement into a specific context that we're facing right now. At the global level, we have huge amounts of trade uncertainties. This is actually not a new thing. This is something that comes and goes in different cycles over time. But obviously, the way that we think as human beings is that this is really something that's deeply important for us to consider right this minute. And there are some very serious threats at the global level. Threats to the World Trade Organization, which if in December there is no resolution, we'll see the collapse of the dispute settlement system that has enabled trade to be managed over the last 25 years. So there's no doubt that these types of uncertainties are fueling a particular view about trade. Trade has become a much more interesting topic, I think, to most people these days. You have a lot more discussion taking place around trade than certainly in most of my career as a trade person. I think what's interesting about this context and what's interesting about the fact that we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement coming together at the same time is that it is Africa demonstrating its commitment to multilateralism in some ways. It's showing that there is a commitment to a shared response to some of the economic development challenges that are faced on the continent, and that we remain wedded to the ideas of regional integration as a way to move forward many of the countries on the continent. It is definitely a very ambitious initiative that has the potential to knit together the African countries that to date have had much stronger economic links to Europe, to the US, and increasingly to China. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the fact that our infrastructure goes outwards. What we trade is largely commodities, raw materials still that are used in the production of value-added products in other parts of the world. And so the African Continental Free Trade Agreement seeks to unravel some of those very deep ties. I think it's also important to remember the context of the continent itself. So not just the global context, but the fact that this is coming out of many decades of work on integration. This is something that President Mbeki referred to. And we aren't seeking with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to see existing regional blocks unraveled. We're seeking to build on things like the SADC Free Trade Agreement, the example that was provided this morning. But the reality is that with that context comes the same types of challenges that we have been facing for achieving real practical integration over many decades. And I'd just like to highlight a few of those because I think that this is where the rubber really hits the road, certainly for most business people out there. One is that tariffs are not as important for increasing intra-African trade or any kind of trade as they once were. Certainly when the drafters of the Abuja Treaty put forward a model that looked at moving through the various stages that we follow for regional integration from a free trade area, which we're currently trying to construct, to a customs union and a common market after that. The tariffs were in those days much more important to trade. Right now, tariffs don't count for much, to tell you the truth, except for a very few exceptional products, maybe clothing and textiles, automotives, and some agricultural products. Vast majority of goods move tariff, duty, quota free, everywhere in the world, including into all African countries. So when you look at increasing intra-African trade, at having an impact through trade on economic development, tariffs is actually number 4 on the list of things we should be doing. First on the list, according to work that's been done to try and model the impacts of these changes, is if we improved access to finance for businesses, for private sector, for women, entrepreneurs. If we were able to actually deal with the bankability of projects, the ability of our small and medium enterprises to get credit, then we would see a much bigger impact on our economic development on the continent than removing a few tariffs on a handful of products. The second most important thing we could be doing is bringing down logistics and transport costs. On the continent, in South Africa even, just alone, the costs for a good that we consume, this bottle of water for example, you're looking at logistics contributing 50 to 60% of the cost to a consumer. That is much, much higher than anywhere else in the world. And we have a number of reasons for why that is the case. It can be vested interests in our fairly uncompetitive transport sector, to tell you the truth. A lot of trade facilitation barriers that are still faced at land borders around the continent. Land borders, notoriously difficult to move and to free up in many ways. They are their own little economic zones, if you like, with a lot of things that need to be unpacked if we are going to make our borders more efficient. The third thing that we could do is improve that infrastructure. That's the obvious one. That's the one that President Mbeki spoke about this morning again when he was looking at the role China has played on the continent as well. Is improving that infrastructure will do more for increasing intra-African trade, for growing economic development than bringing down tariffs. So I think that what's important for me is that when we as South Africa are looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and we're deciding on our position in this regard, we shouldn't lose sight of the concept of developmental integration. This was a concept that was born and bred in South Africa, born from the approach of Minister Rob Davies at the time and his team, where the idea that you can't just look at market access challenges in isolation from other aspects of a trade agenda. You can't separate bringing down tariffs from improving infrastructure, from building up your capacity to be able to produce goods that other people want to buy. And so I think that sometimes I feel we have lost our way a bit in terms of our trade policy. We haven't had a trade policy update in this country since 2012. And when you think about how the world has changed in those last 7 years, it's just a few of the things we've touched on here today, like the global context, like the regional context, that are not reflected necessarily in the strategic trade policy framework that South Africa has in place from 2012. So I would really encourage us not to get caught up on tariffs. I sit often in NEDLAC meetings. For any of you who've ever had the privilege of sitting in a NEDLAC session, you'll know that this is an interesting way to understand the political economy of South African trade policy development. You sit there and you have the Labour Department, the Labour Union representatives saying, no, we can't possibly give more than 80% of tariff line reductions to the rest of the African continent. The trade negotiators have already said, no, we're giving at least 90%. So we're sitting there in a very interesting environment trying to figure out how South Africa needs to bring down its list of protected products to fit within a 90%. My proposition is South Africa should, as a very minimum baseline, be giving duty-free, quota-free access to every least developed country on this continent. And I would really hope that that is something that we could push forward and see as a deliverable from South Africa's chairmanship of the African Union in 2020. So I'm very happy to take questions and to talk about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement further in the interactions. Thanks, Prof.
The challenge goes to IGG. A lot is being put on your plate, but I think it will also assist in really cleaning out of this the relevant contemporary and critical issues for research, and not only research, how we can have in implementation. South Africa is very good when it comes to policies. I don't think there is any area we don't have policies. We may not be updating them, but politics we have. Let's move to the realm of implementation. And IGD is talking about training. It is in that area where I think we can make effective contribution. And I'm beginning to have a sense, Executive Director, that the publications for the book for the celebration are beginning to emerge. I can already identify the papers. And some of them, we're going to follow them up to make sure they give us those papers. Right. Thank you very much. It's now question time. I think we've got roving mics. I don't mind the preface, but let the preface not be a presentation in and by itself. Right? Okay. So usually you'll be the last. Let's start with Ambassador Zabu, and then we'll go. We'll deal with this side and go this side.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a few remarks. One, let me start by the chairmanship of South Africa for 2020. We need to understand in context what does that mean. What does chairmanship of the AU mean? And the relationship between the chair and the commission, which remains and still continues to do its work. It doesn't mean that if you are chair, you take over everything. Originally, the idea of having a chair was to minimize these meetings between the continent and every other country. That what you need somebody who will assist in that process, who will be the chair, who is the head of state, who will, together with the other 4 regional chairs, will move together and engage together with the other agencies of the AU, so that the continent does not stop because one country is somewhere else. That was the rationale behind it. But I think it had assumed, depending on the character of who's chairing, it had assumed in different ways. And it has created a lot of problems. I think we should not go in that direction. We need to be very careful as South Africa as to our understanding of what a chairmanship is. Otherwise, we are going to be at the end of that chairmanship said we failed. Failed on things that we are normally doing, things that will create problems. I hope that before we even embark If you look at the history of African economic integration, there have been many things that we did as a continent. But the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action. There is in force and in existence in terms of the processes that we followed at the time of the OAU, an African Economic Community. OAU summit used to meet as an African Economic Community to deal with the challenges of integration. That stopped the transformation to the AU, the emergence of NEPAD, the other things, and then integration became an incidental issue. And the relationship between the AU and the REX became even more complicated. And we tried to explain it in terms of subsidiarity. That's not the Abuja, what the Abuja Treaty and the Lagos Plan of Action had suggested. So we veered completely away from that, and we are trying to improvise outside of a framework that we've adopted. That's number one. The two, I think part of the problem which has been admitted and we're struggling to correct, when there was a decision to have 2 summits a year, I think the AU started getting into serious trouble. In a way, 2 summits a year. It was thought that we can be able to do a lot of things to facilitate decision making. Every summit had a theme and declaration stated on everything. No implementation. That is a major weakness. What President May was also talking about Asia. He was hinting that on most of these issues that decisions and no implementation. This is what we need to look at. Why is it that we are not implementing? And one of the reasons is because we want somebody to give us the finance. We don't want to use our own money to implement our own decisions. That's part of the major weakness. This dependency that we have at the bilateral level with donor assistance, we transfer it to the AU. That's why you can't move. And there are attempts to try and correct that, but it has been difficult. President Paul Kagame tried within his presidency to get this thing. There are proposals on the table, there are no solutions. At the time when everybody thought there was an agreement at some point last year, in one meeting, I think we had this at the time, and people were telling us that no, the meeting is over, there's an agreement. After about 30 minutes, we were told there's a deadlock, no agreement, nothing. I think this is a problem of leadership in the continent. I don't want to elaborate even further. If you look at our electoral processes and what they produce, tells you something about what is happening. What happens at the national level, we repeat it at a major scale within the AU. Because these things are not taken seriously. As long as I'm president, I have a convoy and every other thing else, it's fine. And I can make deals and all of those things. I think leadership becomes a key question. The Nigeria-South African relations, I think they can easily be corrected. We miss opportunities to do so. The Binational Commission was meant precisely to address that. Because it was only Nigeria and Algeria where you had binational commissions at the head of state level, and then the DRC followed. But the DRC was just one event after another, or non-event after another. Because of governance issues there, you can't have a binational commission with a government that is almost not there most of the time. That's part of the problem of instability. But I think with Nigeria, we have also to take into consideration that what contributed towards that, the collapse of the binational commission, and made it difficult for those relationships to happen, is the elections that took place in Nigeria, and I think to some extent the change of guard here. I'm sure you know it better, and that factor still hangs on us. Yes. And it's something that we need to find a way of correcting. Personal relationships undermine the interest that we've had that we could have pushed forward. Everything collapsed because there was no engagement. Some of us tried at a particular level to do so, and we continue to try to do so, but that cannot be a substitute. I think this situation can be salvaged. It's very easy to salvage. We don't need to go about apologizing for acts that we have not committed, instead of addressing the reality of how we should be managing our relationship. I believe that it can be done, and our engagements at particular levels, maybe outside of the elected people now, or other people that are within government structures, but it had to be done and must feed into those processes. It's something that, for me, it's something that can be rescued. You see what happened here at when the president of Nigeria was here. Yes. What happened at the Sheraton Hotel, it tells you a different story. The Nigerians that were embarrassing. There are no South Africans. A number of issues. The other reality is that most of the companies that were being attacked in Nigeria, if you look at the ownership structures, they're owned by Nigerians. They have the biggest shares in those companies, not South Africans. Originally, South African companies which are managed, they've taken the ownership is with Nigerians. So how you correct that is a manner in which you begin to deal with those realities. I'm sorry to take it a little bit long, but I think all I'm saying is that there are solutions to these problems. There is nothing beyond it. We have to deal with the reality of what is happening and be able to make sure that in the interest of everybody, we can be able to resolve those questions. Zeenat will raise a lot of questions, and unfortunately, it will take us 2 weeks to respond to it. It's a session that is very critical.
Thank you very much. I thought this was quite an interesting panel, complemented the earlier panel as well. Just a question, it's something that Catherine said that I think talks to everything that we have been discussing in the last couple of hours today, and that is, if there hasn't been an update of the trade policy, we have a similar dilemma in foreign policy. There hasn't been an update of the foreign policy white paper. And I think the challenge around where we take South African foreign policy is how do we find the ministries working together in terms of a direction, in terms of the policy, in terms of coordinating capacity and coordinating implementation, because somehow you get the sense that everybody's working within a silo of each other and they're not speaking to each other. And of course, the work that we do in Parliament becomes even more critical because you need those portfolio committees to work together. And having just sat through a parliamentary meeting on the border management agency, it was quite frightening to see how certain compromises were made in terms of taking out a vital component like SARS and their function of that bill. So just
Just a comment, especially Catherine, because I think working in the application of policy is something in terms of how we get everybody on that one page in terms of foreign policy and economic policy making.
Yeah, all right, yes. All right, this will be the last question this side, yes. Right, thanks. Then we'll go this side, we'll take 2 or 3, then we close.
Good afternoon, my name is Fred Thompson. I'm with an organization called IDPAD for You. IDPAD for You, the International Decade for People of African Descent. Listening to all 3 panelists, I kept wondering about the integration of the 6th region. Babatunde, when you spoke, one of the things that kept going through my mind is the amount of remittance that's coming from Nigerians in the diaspora, and how do we incorporate them into our overall strategies. But one of the things that I found missing was that the 6th region, the diaspora, I didn't hear coming out in the integration as well as the after. Thank you.
Thank you. One more.
Thank you, Faith Makokera with the IGD. This is for Zeenat. So in light of South Africa's position on the MENA issues, right? And in addition to that, so I'm curious to gather what your opinion is with regards to the potential resuscitation, if I can call it that, of the Arab Maghreb Union, which has been defined in North Africa for a while. And this, I'm in full appreciation of the fact that a possible resuscitation of that regional mechanism is complicated by the fact that in the North Africa region we have a lot of geopolitical dynamics, for instance, the activities of the Arab Project, the activities of the GCC, and that sort of impacts the question of political will. So do you see it ever coming back? Could we need it in light of Egypt, Tunisia, Libya? We need it in that regard. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to give the panelists a chance to respond. Let's start with specific questions, and then you also wrap up your views. There is a mic there? Yes. You can go first.
Oh, okay.
Go first.
Yes, there were a couple of comments. The Nigerian-South African relations, of course it is not beyond redemption. I think both countries have no choice not to work together. You would have all of those skirmishes and of course, coming from the lack of dynamic leadership, on both sides, to commit to a serious program. And one of the things I've looked at in some of the work I've done in terms of resuscitating this partnership is looking at, for example, we need to start asking ourselves particular question on how we can even use this relation between Nigeria and South Africa as a nucleus or some sort of a laboratory or experimenting with many of these projects, many of these Continental projects. And part of what I've done in the past is to look at what you call the Lagos-Johannesburg axis of influence. So looking at these 2 cities, I mean, these 2 cities actually are the top 10 biggest economies on the continent. I think Lagos is the last time was about 7th biggest economy on the continent, taken out of Nigeria as a standalone country, and Johannesburg as well. And how both cities could actually play a key role in terms of cultural diplomacy, even in terms of the academia. And of course, I come from the higher education sector, and I understand some of the challenges and some of the roles that higher education could play. South Africa has, some of the best universities on this continent in terms of access to resources, in terms of ability to access latest research materials. At the click of a button, you get any research. for at least for my works, all of these things we could access. And the question is, how do partners? So of course, Nigeria also suffers from lack of access to resources, lack of in the academia, and how we could begin to set up partnerships between those universities. For research, for so many other things. Culture is also a very big role, a very big thing as well. The Nigerian music, the Nigerian people have written a lot about the soft power aspect of it. Nigerian movie, Nigerian music, Nigerian dish, and all of those things. And people-to-people interaction, essentially. How do we begin to build this people-to-people interaction? And of course, education, cultural exchange, educational exchange programs, and all of those things. How do we begin to think outside of the box and be able to build this partnership? So I agree with that at a certain level. It's definitely not beyond redemption. The destiny of this continent actually lies with the ability of these countries to just get their acts together. I think it was Adebayo who referred to them as people giants, both. The next one was on remittances, the Nigerian diaspora. Of course, it's a very, very, very big factor in terms of the money that comes from the diaspora into Nigeria. And one of the key things, where speaking of the issue of remittances, is how do you also use these remittances and many of these issues to actually finance African Union development projects. I know Ethiopia was able to use part of the remittances to build the dam from the citizens overseas. And how, of course, there was a time when people even suggested that perhaps maybe part of our salaries should also go to, certain part of our salaries should go to African Union, financing the African Union, and, how do we generate income for the African Union. So we need to think around this. And Nigeria now has what you call the Diaspora Commission, the standalone commission that deals with Nigerians in diaspora and understanding the capacity of this group to be able to develop the country. Speaking of the sixth province, or the sixth region of the African Union, I think Haiti was able to, apply to become a member of the African Union using this, but for you to be able to do that, you need to amend the African Union Constitution. The African Union Constitution is very clear, Article 29 says for you to be a member of the African Union, you have to be geographically located within the continent, which, and it requires a majority of member states to also change that so that you can bring the diaspora into it. And for me, I was hoping that the African Union would have used the Haiti test, the case study, to use it as an opportunity to push itself to actually, open up and see whether you could bring the diaspora. But of course, there's a lot of role the diaspora can play, and I think Ghana has been the most Ghana has been the most strategic of all African countries by declaring this year as the year of return, and of course, it's cashing it on it as well. I mean, there are a lot of people going to Ghana now, and using it as a basis of service.
Thanks very much, and thanks Ambassador Schlafel for providing even more context, I think, historical context as well, for understanding the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and where it fits right now in terms of the African agenda. I'd like to pick up on 2 points that you mentioned. One was the funding and the challenges of financing implementation of these many declarations and these many initiatives, and I very much share the concern about that when it comes to the trade area, because definitely the process we're seeing unfold for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is being bankrolled by the European Union right now, and it does beg the question of whether the process is being driven at the speed that is appropriate for the member states of the AfCFTA, or whether it's being pushed at a speed that's faster because we have to spend the money on having various negotiating sessions and so forth because of the budgets of donors. So I do think that there is some quite complex issues to be unpacked around the financing, including of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement going forward. And the other point about complex relationships between the AU and the regional economic communities, I think that's actually at the heart of how you could try and find ways to see integration fully realised on this continent. And it's been a bit of an elephant in the room to a certain extent in the trade negotiations, whilst the focus has been on unpacking things like how many tariff lines we're going to be reducing our tariff rates on and so forth. In fact, there was supposed to be a meeting of the AU's Commission and the Regional Economic Community Secretariats only a couple of weeks ago, but it didn't happen. So I think that this is a very challenging issue that requires a lot more future focus. So Nusha's point about how do ministries work together to achieve implementation, I think I would expand it, Nusha. I think it's also in my field, in the trade area, also about how all stakeholders in economic diplomacy terms work together. Because I think the reality is that it's not just about the government agencies in these instances. You need to have your private sector involved. You do need to include your broader civil society, your labour unions and so forth as well. And I think that is something that we have had varying degrees of success with in different parts of the African continent and at different national levels. So I think that that's something that really needs to be focused on. Interesting to me was that there was a light bulb moment in a NEDLAC meeting recently, and this is after 2 years of negotiating the Continental Free Trade Agreement, where for the first time I saw members of both the business and labour constituencies understanding that this is just not one agreement. This is in fact an overarching framework that is going to cover a whole range of agreements. And South Africa itself, or SACU, as we negotiated with SACU, may end up with sort of 30 or 40 different agreements under this overall umbrella. And so this to me really illustrated the point that we hadn't been taking along with us all the constituencies involved in this process. And so I think one of the things we're talking about in the context of the IGD with our colleagues at the University of Cape Town is about online training and accessibility, how we improve the actual availability of accurate information to the widest range possible of stakeholders on these types of trade initiatives. Remittances, I very much agree with Fred's point that remittances are critical. And for me, I would not want to get them mixed up into a trade agreement per se. I think it would become too complex. But I think where they are incredibly important to be considered and to be brought into the debates at the AU level is with regards to those other very critical things that unlock economic development, such as access to finance, such as building infrastructure, as was mentioned by Babatunde there. So I think that there is an incredible scope to bring that sixth region into the processes, maybe just not necessarily in the framework of the trade agreement that we currently have. I'd just like to make one comment on the idea of chemistry and personal relationships. Because I think I disagree to a certain extent about that we can't build things on chemistry, because I think that in so many ways things start from good chemistry. And marriage is probably being one example. And so I don't think we can underplay sometimes the chemistry, because yes, it may not sustain a long-term engagement. I think that chemistry can be so critical, and I would really like to acknowledge in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there was a particular chemistry between the Nigerian chief trade negotiator, the late J.D. Osakwe, and the head of the South African negotiating team, a gentleman, former now, Makokera from the DTI. Their chemistry was what enabled the progress that we saw in the context of about a year of negotiations. They had both spent a lot of time together in the past, including in the WTO context. They had a similar vision, a similar approach, and it was one of the things that we have seen the repercussions of it no longer being there in the last 3 or 4 months. So whilst I tend to agree you can't just rely on chemistry alone for the long run, if you're trying to build momentum and get things started from a political economy point of view, we talk about champions, chemistry counts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Faith, for your question on whether or not there is a potential for resuscitation of the Maghreb Union. I think at this stage, if we look at what has transpired since the Arab Spring and is still transpiring in the region, it probably isn't going to happen anytime soon. It may be necessary, but we still have a long way to go to stabilizing the region. Right now, I think the only stable country in the Maghreb Union, and even then it's questionable, is Morocco. And that's because of certain reforms that they're trying to introduce to take away from the monarchy and hand over to a prime minister and to have a cabinet that has some semblance of democracy. Whereas the other countries are still grappling with the aftermath, and in particular Libya and Egypt. And I think that we also as South Africa have to take responsibility for what has been happening in Egypt. We had a principled position as part of the African Union that we would not recognize coup leaders. And yet we went back on that, and very easily and very quickly, and allowed ourselves to engage someone like Sisi. And in fact, Shannon, who was on the previous panel, revealed a few weeks ago in an article that we are wanting to sell arms to Egypt now. So where are our principles, and where are our efforts to try and stabilize these regions when we are actually contributing to the destabilization? I want to make a few other points that I may have brushed over in my introductory comments. I'm very concerned about the company that we're keeping within BRICS at the moment. And I know it's a difficult discussion to have because we have found ourselves quite friendly with these countries. But out of the 5 BRICS members, 4 of them are fascists. And are we comfortable with that? We don't say anything when it comes to China and their policies against the Uyghurs or their policies against those in Hong Kong, 6 months of democratic protests taking place. We don't talk about India and Kashmir that has been on lockdown for 112 days with no communication in or out, and it is an occupying force. We don't talk about what's happening in Brazil with Bolsonaro. We do not talk about what Russia is doing, not only in its own region, but in the Middle East and in Africa. And we look at these as our leaders when it comes to decision making on an international scale. We need to wake up, and we need to decide how far our compromises for economic benefit go, and when do we hold those countries accountable, and we can use the BRICS platform to hold them accountable. Why shouldn't we have to do that? I think we also need to reflect on the new Scramble for Africa, and when I talk about this, I want to reflect on the Maghreb Union and on the Horn of Africa in particular, where you have countries from the Gulf region who are now very wealthy and utilizing that wealth for their own ambitions into these countries. And we need to be very watchful about what their ambitions are in Africa and how that may potentially change the dynamics for us as an African country and as part of the African Union. How do we mitigate against some of the negative impacts that this may have, and how do we embrace the positive impacts it may have? Because there are positives as well. I think we have to be careful about our self-censorship. And I want to urge South Africa that as we reflect and as we start to change the way in which we project what our future policies are, and in the introductory comments, I think we were looking at what happens in the next 80 years in the 21st century. Shouldn't we be leading the revolution within the United Nations? Where is that revolutionary spirit that we have always imbued? We've lost that. And just a last point, two last points. One was on the previous panel we spoke about the ICC and talking about whether or not South Africa should be withdrawing from that. I think these are questions we need to really reflect on, and I think that we've lost an opportunity. I read this week that on the issue of Rohingya, that was also mentioned in the previous panel, that the Gambia, a small African country like the Gambia, is championing the cause of the Rohingya. What have we done? We had Ruth Mayer going there as part of an investigative team, and then what did we do? Are we so enamored with Aung San Suu Kyi that we can't criticize? That we can't say that what is happening is wrong? And lastly, what Sanusha was talking about in terms of silos and the ministries, I think it goes beyond the ministries. I was working in DIRCO previously, but even subsequent to that, I've engaged DIRCO as an independent from outside. One of the engagements that I had was on the issue of Syria, because I had written a letter to President Cyril Ramaphosa to question what our position was on Syria. It took 5 months to get a response. I was called to a meeting with our section that deals with human rights in DIRCO, and we had a full panel of people around the table, and not one of them knew what the BRICS position was, and not one of them knew what our bilateral position was. They were only there to tell me what our position in Geneva was. And I think that is where we are failing in foreign policy, because we don't talk to each other even within the same building.
Yes. I hear comment of politics.